Aloha mai kako, you are watching Hawaii Political Reporter.
Some events echo through the pages of history, causing ripples decades or even centuries later. These secondary consequences are sometimes a direct result of the events themselves, but more often than not, they are driven by our perception, the mythology that we build around those events. The narrative of 9/11 defined the past decade. It was used to justify the Patriot Act, the indefinite detention provisions in the NDAA of 2012 and 2013, and it was used to take America into war against Afghanistan, then Iraq. 4,000 Americans may have died on that day, but well over 1 million civilians died based on the story of what happened. Of course, the fact that so much death and destruction was justified using that narrative makes it emotionally difficult for many Americans to re-examine it. After all, admitting you were wrong when nothing is at stake is hard enough, but if the official story of 9/11 is wrong, then this would mean that the US government killed all those civilians and shredded your Constitution based on a lie, and some of you were cheering them on. When people need to believe something, the facts matter very little. Reality can be twisted and bent into any shape needed, information discarded, and contradictions ignored. Never underestimate people's willingness to delude themselves. In America, where the need to believe is most entrenched, you'll rarely see September 11th addressed without some people resorting to third grader level name calling. Tinfoil hat, conspiracy theorists, conspiratards, 9/11 nutters. I'm sure you've heard these. It's the lowest and least sophisticated flavor of logical fallacy, the ad hominem. But it works when you're dealing with people who operate on a third grade level. What's most hilarious about this attempt to stigmatize those who dare question the official story is the fact that many of the members of the actual 9/11 Commission have spoken out to say that the investigation was a sham.
I want to start by asking you, as co-chairman of the 9/11 Commission, what your basic reaction is to this study by the Center for Public Integrity. It shows there were 935 statements, false statements, by these top 8 administration officials.
Well, I commend what the Center has done. It's taken exhaustive research to go through all of the statements made by these top public officials and to pick out the instances where they just flat out told us what was not the truth in order to move us towards war in Iraq. And I think you've performed a very valuable public service. And I hope the lesson that arises, that comes from all of your work, is that all of us have to be more skeptical of statements made by our public leaders and scrutinize those statements with very great care.
Look, why didn't they talk about Building 7 in the report?
That's good.
Why do you think that was
I don't
left out?
I don't have an easy answer for it. I mean, I would ask it one time.
Can you see this medical thing right now?
Yeah. Anyway,
I'm out of battery.
Do you support a criminal investigation into 9/11? Because I know yours was an exposition. It was not a criminal investigation.
I don't think so, but I don't know. I mean, I do support a permanent commission to examine not just that, but lots of other things in this area.
But if it's a permanent cover-up, then it's. I mean, if it's an act of war and it's hiding things, which everyone on your commission knew that the Pentagon was changing their stories, lying to you,
Right.
and it's a cover-up of an act of war, and under Article 3, Section 3 of the Constitution, it's treason. So unless we get to the very bottom of it, then we're still talking a treasonous exposition.
This is a longer conversation. I'm not sure you ever get to the bottom of it.
We have to, or we can't save our country, sir.
I don't think. Well, if that's the condition upon which we're going to be saving our country, because the problem is it's a 30-year-old conspiracy.
No, I'm talking about 9/11.
That's what I'm talking about.
Oh, you are. You mean at this?
Yeah. Anyway.
Guys, it doesn't matter if the people who actually ran the investigation say it was a scam. You're supposed to believe the official story. If you don't, you're crazy, unhinged, and maybe even a little bit dangerous. Listen, I know you don't want anyone to think you're crazy, but let's just take a look at a little bit of the evidence, just between me and you. I won't tell anyone, I promise. Now, this isn't a 2-hour documentary, so we don't have time to cover everything. Instead, we'll just confront a few obvious smoking guns. Smoking gun number 1, the collapse of the World Trade Center Building 7. 3 buildings collapsed in New York on that day. 2 were hit by planes. Building 7 was not hit by a plane. No one claims that it was. Yet at 5:20 p.m. on September 11th, it collapsed into its own footprint. It went straight down at free fall speed. At first, NIST tried to deny this and placed its computer models over the actual video evidence. But in their final report, they do in fact admit that the building fell at free fall. Why is this significant?
It's just like taking your car keys out and just dropping them. That's how fast the building came down, for over 100 feet.
This is high school physics.
A building cannot do free fall with 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system without it being blown up.
It's the only way that a building can accelerate as it collapses is by having pre-engineered, precisely timed, and precisely placed explosives. In other words, controlled demolition.
The funny thing is, in spite of the fact that never in history had a steel frame building collapsed due to an office fire, a lot of people knew the building was going to collapse before it came down. We have CNN reporting the collapse an hour before it came down.
We are getting information now that one of the other buildings, Building 7 in the World Trade Center complex, is on fire and has either collapsed or is collapsing.
We also have the BBC who reported the collapse even though the building was still visible in the background.
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago, I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were. And it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy. There's almost a sense downtown in New York behind me, down by the World Trade Centers, of just an area completely closed off as the rescue workers try to do their job. But this isn't the first building that has suffered as a result. We know that part of the Marriott Hotel next to the World Trade Center also collapsed as a result of this huge amount of falling debris from 110 floors of the two twin towers of the World Trade Center. As you can see behind me,
we have footage of people on the street warning that the building was about to collapse.
You hear that? Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down. This building is about to blow up. Move it back.
How did they know that this was going to happen when it isn't even physically possible for an ordinary office fire to bend or melt steel? It makes about as much sense as a farmer suddenly warning you that his pig is about to levitate. And this brings us to smoking gun number 2. Explosions in the basements of the Twin Towers and on the lower floors of Building 7.
I worked in the building for 20 years. I was the person in charge of all the stairwells of the North Tower, and on 9/11 I had the only master key that opened the doors that rescue people. This is the master key, they call it the key of hope. And basically I was a janitor. Like I said, on that day there was an explosion on the basement, and this is prior to the building got hit by the plane, and then the plane hit, and then there was a series of explosions afterwards, and a person comes running into the office saying explosion, explosion, explosion. His skin was pulled all from his armpits all the way to the top of the fingertips, and pieces missing off his face, and then it was total chaos.
Penny Johanneman. Spell your name. Johannemann. And you were working there? Yes, I was right there. I was down in the basement, came down, all of a sudden the elevator blew up, smoke. I dragged the guy out, his skin was hanging off, and I dragged him out, and I helped him out to the ambulance.
Mr. Hess came running back in. He said, we're the only ones up here, we got to get out of here. He found the stairwell. So we subsequently went to the stairwell and we're going down the stairs. When we reached the 8th or the 6th floor, the landing that we were standing on gave way. There was an explosion and the landing gave way. And I was left there hanging. I had to climb back up, and now I had to walk back up to the 8th floor. I was trapped in there for several hours. I was trapped in there when both buildings came down. All this time, I'm hearing all types of explosions. All this time, I'm hearing explosions. When they finally got to us, and they took us down to what they called the lobby, because I asked them, I said, when we got down there, I said, where are we? He said, this was the lobby. And I said, you gotta be kidding me. It was total ruins. Total ruins. Now keep in mind, when I came in there, the lobby had nice escalators. It was a huge lobby. And for me to see what I saw, it was unbelievable. I'm just confused about one thing, and one thing only. Why World Trade Center 7 went down in the first place. I'm very confused about that. I know what I heard. I heard explosions. The explanation I got was, it was the fuel oil tank. I'm an old boiler guy. If it was a fuel oil tank, it would have been one side of the building.
This of course brings us to smoking gun number 3, molten steel found in the basements of the buildings after the collapse.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails, like you're in a foundry.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
So if you have a flame at 750 degrees, you can hold that flame under a steel beam forever, and you'll never reach a high enough temperature to bend steel, let alone melt it.
It wasn't just Building 7 that went down like a controlled demolition. All 3 buildings that collapsed in New York that day came down at free fall speed. The thousands of tons of steel and concrete beams that should have resisted such a collapse were blown apart as the building was falling. Over 1,700 licensed architects and engineers have gone on record to say that the official 9/11 story is physically impossible. It would have required carefully placed explosives to take out the support beams. And guess what? The dust from the ruins of the towers has been independently tested and shown to contain large quantities of military-grade nanothermite. The results of these tests were peer-reviewed and published in the Open Chemical Physics Journal in 2009. However, the agency behind the official investigation, NIST, has refused from the very beginning to test for any accelerants or explosives in the dust. This in spite of the fact that such testing is explicitly called for in fire investigation standards for events involving this kind of damage.
My name is Mark Basile. I'm a chemical engineer. I have a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering from Worcester Polytechnic Institute. I've worked for about 25 years in industry, and the majority of what I do is analytical work and figuring out what materials are composed of, why they are what they are, why they do what they do. It's basically a lot of material science is what I do. In December of 2007, I attended a conference in Boston on 9/11 where Stephen Jones was going to be speaking about his work on the iron-based microspheres. I attended the conference and listened to him talk, where he also, for the first time, discussed his discovery of the red-gray chips that we'll get into a little bit later here. After he spoke, I approached him and I was interested in being put in contact with a source for World Trade Center dust to independently look at the material and either confirm or deconfirm what he had found. About a month later, I received my first sample of World Trade Center dust from Jeanette McKinley, which was one of the individuals that was spoken of in his report on the thermetic materials that he put out in March of 2009, I think it was. So anyway, I received a sample of dust in January of 2008 and basically started working with the material. I found iron-based microspheres in there, just as he had done, and I also found the red-gray chips that he had spoken of. I created an apparatus where I could basically control energy input to the chips, heating them resistively on a stainless steel heater strip to an ignition temperature, not overheating them, but just bringing them up to the ignition temperature, and then analyzing the resultant products. And what I can confirm also is that these chips, the red layer is thermitic, it does produce molten iron, and I've seen it in a number of chips that Jeanette McKinley supplied to me, and I've also seen it in an independent sample that was also supplied to me from a museum in New York, which is asked to remain anonymous at this point. One of the things I'd like to stress about these chips is that they really shouldn't be there. They're not a natural formed agglomeration of aluminum from the aircraft or materials that were in the building and iron oxide that got knocked off. It isn't just a haphazard bringing together of iron oxide and aluminum, which is the basic components of thermite. This is a material that is made up of nano-sized particles that are all very uniform, very symmetrical. It's in a silica-based matrix that holds the whole thing together, and when they're ignited, these iron droplets that are formed basically eat through the silica matrix and form both droplets, and there actually creates these large relative voids within the residue of the chip that are all coated with iron films inside.
We're not even scratching the surface here. No matter what part of the official story you look at, there are glaring holes that require magical thinking to explain away. You were lied to, pure and simple, and a lot of people were killed based on that lie. I know that's uncomfortable to look at, but it's the truth. So why are we looking at this now, 12 years after the fact? First of all, because the war on terror is still underway. There are people being killed right now because of this lie, and the federal government is grabbing more and more dictatorial power to supposedly protect you. Furthermore, those who control the US government are trying to find a way to take America to war with Syria, a war which will draw in Iran, Russia, and China, World War III. But the American people aren't going for it. They aren't buying the propaganda. So to convince the people to back this war, they're going to have to do something big, something that makes 9/11 pale in comparison. This is just how they operate. Problem, reaction, solution is pretty much the only tool they have at their disposal. Originality is not their forte. The stigma surrounding 9/11 research and the juvenile way that the uninformed attempt to cower those who speak out into silence is more than just an obstacle to truth. As long as the powers that be think that they can get away with this kind of thing, and as long as you keep accepting their ridiculous stories at face value, they'll keep doing it. Waking up isn't a matter of personal preference. It's a question of life and death.
I frankly think that crisis initiation is really tough. And it's very hard for me to see how the United States president can get us to war with Iran. Which leads me to conclude that if, in fact, compromise is not coming, that the traditional way of America gets to war is what would be best for U.S. interests. Some people might think that Mr. Roosevelt wanted to get us into World War II, as David mentioned. You may recall we had to wait for Pearl Harbor. Some people might think Mr. Wilson wanted to get us into World War I. You may recall he had to wait for the Lusitania episode. Some people might think that Mr. Johnson wanted to send troops to Vietnam. You may recall he had to wait for the Gulf of Tonkin episode. We didn't go to war with Spain until the until the Maine exploded. And may I point out that Mr. Lincoln did not feel he could call out the Federal Army until Fort Sumter was attacked, which is why he ordered the commander at Fort Sumter to do exactly that thing which the South Carolinians had said would cause an attack. So if, in fact, the Iranians aren't going to compromise, it would be best if somebody else started the war.
Welcome. This is James Corbett of CorbettReport.com.
And this is James Evan Pilato of MediaMonarchy.com, welcoming you back to another important episode of The New World Next Week, which, of course, you can find everything you need, sources, resources, audio, video, and much more at NewWorldNextWeek.com. James, it is now September 12th. And, of course, yesterday we had the 12th anniversary of the catalyzing and catastrophic events of September 11th, 2001. And you've done amazing work over the last day. We were just kind of joking about it off mic about the mass amount of work that you did. And I think, of course, folks should check out CorbettReport.com for all the interviews and things that you did and put out just today. So I think we'll begin with just a brief kind of recap and look at some of the new news stories surrounding the catalyzing catastrophic events. And we'll take it from rethink911.org. New poll finds most Americans open to alternative 9/11 theories. On the 12th anniversary of 9/11, a new national survey by the polling firm YouGov reveals that 1 in 2 Americans, that's 50%, have doubts about the government's account of 9/11. And after viewing footage of World Trade Center Building 7's collapse, 46% suspect that it was caused by a controlled demolition. The video that they show folks, which is just a sort of contextless shot of this building falling down, which anyone who's not living under a rock would look at it and go, oh, well, they blew that building up, right? Oh, is that in Vegas? And people didn't learn that it was Building 7 in Manhattan. Interestingly enough, James, and again, we'll provide all the links and implore folks to go spread these and do the research for themselves. Time Magazine has a piece about 9/11 Truthers Mark Anniversary, and they actually source and reference the aforementioned rethink911.org. With a billboard in Times Square and a global ad campaign, a group keeps questioning what happened 12 years ago. Another story is our friend Niall Bowie, who has a new piece, a new op-ed piece on RT.com, has questioning 9/11 become more acceptable? And I think we just showed you that it has. Interestingly enough, James, of course, there's always going to be tasteless, ridiculous things that happen. AT&T makes controversial connection to 9/11 anniversary. The company posted a Twitter photo of a hand holding up a smartphone with the screen displaying the tribute in light, the 2 light beams on the site of the Twin Towers, and of course were completely excoriated for it following that. Even more insane, James, and I'm not sure if you caught this one or not, Boston's Logan Airport, they sure are sorry for the drill that they ran this morning with smoke and flames on 9/11/13. And the last interesting note, James, I find is that it's Assad's birthday today, which I think is just an odd little note, as all the other things that we can look at of 9/11 throughout history, of course, Chile and Operation Condor, all those things, on and on and on, James. So, please.
Absolutely. Well, we don't really, I think those of us in the alternative media don't need a poll to tell us that the majority of Americans do question 9/11, because we have seen this from our own work and from the audience that continues to grow for 9/11 truth information. And I think that really 9/11 truth, this is one of the big successes. I think we are winning. We have won to a large extent in the court of public opinion. There's still a lot of work left to do, so I absolutely applaud the efforts of rethink911.org and all of these other organizations that are continuing to press the issue. But by and large, I think the momentum is on our side, and more people than ever before, at the very least, are looking at new events as they come along, like this Syria chemical weapons attack or the Boston Marathon bombing or what have you, and starting to immediately question the official government narratives as they're coming out. So there really has been a shift in public discourse over the last 12 years, and a lot of that can be attributed to the 9/11 truth movement. That's one of the successes we have to celebrate. As I say, obviously still a lot of work left to do, and as people who have been watching my 9/11 anniversary coverage will know, one of the things that I'm pressing for is to try to move beyond some of the sound bites and regurgitated facts that we've been hearing for the last 12 years, and towards identifying the actual suspects that we could actually prosecute for the crimes of 9/11, which has to be the other main goal of 9/11 truth. And I've been getting a lot of comments from people asking, well, how do we do anything about this? What can we do about it? Well, I briefly touched on that in my interview on Traces of Reality Radio with Guillermo Jimenez yesterday on RBN, so people can go and listen to that conversation at the end where I talk a little bit about that. I'll also be talking about that in the next Questions for Corbett, which will be coming out this Friday. Instead of the podcast, I am completely and utterly exhausted from my Syria coverage and 9/11 coverage, so I don't think I'm going to put a regular podcast out this weekend. Instead, I'll just do a Questions for Corbett and take some of those questions off the table and talk specifically about what people can do to bring the 9/11 criminals to justice.
I think a lot of it too, and I really found myself thinking about that a lot too, the sort of just all the regurgitated facts that anyone who's been involved in 9/11 research over these last 12 years, as I guess the years have now gone by so much that I almost stop and have to remember this, like, oh, I've been thinking about this for 12 years now. I feel like, James, it's in a way, this is maybe the first year that it hasn't been a huge dark cloud over my head in a way, and I feel like I'd like to think it's because I learned about 9/11, I took the lessons to heart, and I've tried to apply them to my life. And so, in a way, I don't feel like I have to kind of regurgitate stuff every year and trot out the same old sort of tired memes and tropes. Ultimately, I think that's what it's all about, is you have to live the truth. And whether 9/11 truth led you to food truth or economic truth, you have to live that in your life, and it can't just be a 9/11 was an inside job slogan.
Exactly right. And just on that note, I think you're right that that 9/11 has become less of a politically relevant thing as it's less and less used as the explicit justification for the tyranny we see going on around us. Of course, it's always in the background there, but as it fades in political relevance, I think there's also the opportunity there as those wounds start to heal over, that it's less of an emotionally raw thing that will incite people's just base instincts. So I think we can actually reach out to people who would have been resistant to this in the past, and that's another opportunity for 9/11 truth moving forward.
Having said that, James, let's move to our second story this week, which is an interesting one, and I referenced that, of course, 9/11 is Bashar al-Assad's birthday. Last month, The Onion, as they are so expert at doing, cut right to the heart of the matter and bust out really interesting, jaw-droppingly funny, but right on the money social commentary sometimes. They purported to have an op-ed piece from Bashar al-Assad last month that it basically said, so what's it going to be? And we'll include that link where basically Assad laid out the fact that America has zero options in dealing with Syria and saying, so what's it going to be? However, it's not satire, James. It is the truth. It was all over the talking head news in the evening hours today. A plea for caution from Russia. That's right. Russian President Vladimir Putin wrote an op-ed that was in the New York Times print edition for 9/11 2013, and I'll just read some of that briefly for you. Recent events surrounding Syria have prompted me to speak directly to the American people and their political leaders. It's important to do so at a time of insufficient communication between our societies. A new opportunity to avoid military action has emerged in the past few days. The United States, Russia, and all members of the international community must take advantage of the Syrian government's willingness to place its chemical arsenal under international control for subsequent destruction. Judging by the statements of President Obama, the United States sees this as an alternative to military action. In closing, and again, I implore you to read the entire thing. I'm just giving you a beginning, middle, and end. My working and personal relationship with President Obama is marked by growing trust. I appreciate this. I carefully studied his address to the nation on Tuesday, and I would rather disagree with a case he made on American exceptionalism, stating that the United States policy is what makes America different. It's what makes us exceptional. It is extremely dangerous to encourage people to see themselves as exceptional, whatever the motivation. There are big countries and small countries, rich and poor, those with long democratic traditions, and those still finding their way to democracy. Their policies differ too. We are all different, but when we ask for the Lord's blessings, we must not forget that God created us all. So writes Vladimir Putin in the New York Times op-ed. James, this was new news to you. What's your take on it?
What a masterstroke of geopolitical genius here from Putin. I have to to take my hats off to this, because this is the type of thing which, if anything, will ever humanize the Russians to the average American, rather than just those inhuman animals that we have to remember are kind of the enemy, although they're not explicitly the enemy, but we have to keep them in check. If there's anything that can actually humanize them, it's something like this, cutting through all the diplomatic crap, all of the meetings behind closed doors between leaders who claim to represent us who do nothing of the sort, and going directly to the American people and saying, look, this is the situation. And on this issue, the vast majority of the American people agree with him. So this is truly, I think, a game-changing event in terms of international relations, and it's the kind of thing that I'd like to see happening more often, not only from Putin to the Americans, but between nations, rather than having these leaders meeting in these top-level conferences. And I hope people do go and read through the entire thing. He really does an excellent job of laying this out in ways that will appeal, I think, to the majority of Americans, invoking God and things like this, but also laying out, I think, a very good case for why the military intervention is a bad idea that's doomed to fail. And he says, for example, a strike would increase violence and unleash a new wave of terrorism. It could undermine multilateral efforts to resolve the Iranian nuclear program and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and further destabilize the Middle East and North Africa. It could throw the entire system of international law and order out of balance. I mean, he frames all of this in the type of language of international relations and the UN supremacy and all of that, which I'm obviously uncomfortable with. But having said all of that, he's exactly right, and I don't think anyone can really dispute that the Syria strike would completely destabilize the region, could threaten to spill the entire region into conflict, would create a new wave of terrorism. I mean, all of these points, which intuitively the American public knows. That's why this war is the least popular war ever proposed in the history of the United States, and why I don't see how Obama can go ahead with a unilateral strike at this point and save any of his political face. So again, masterstroke of geopolitical genius, I think, coming from Putin, and just the right thing at just the right time. And I mean, can you imagine something like this having taken place during the Cold War, a direct address from the Soviet leader to the American public or something? I mean, it's truly, I think, a game-changing event.
It is. You, I think, hit it right on the head, and I think it shows that someone like Putin has been on the grand chessboard a lot longer than Obama, and he pretty much hands him his hat on this case. So, James, you called it. You said game changer.
Hawaii Political Reporter is not owned, influenced, or an agent of corporate, government, or special interest. We are a local, honest, independent source of political news and commentary. Our primary goals are to promote awareness of the non-aggression principle and to reduce violence, war, and death. To promote economic liberty, prosperity, and true civil rights as in the U.S. Constitution. To promote transparency and to bring awareness of corruption in government and the collusion at all levels with big-moneyed individuals and special interests to deprive the people of true choice of government. Government that is truly by and for the people.
Federal Reserve is no more federal than Federal Express.
You try a hide and destroy a freedom. You seek agenda, we know you anti-American. You come forward American Constitution. 1913, corrupt in the system. Devalue dollar, hyperinflation. The Federal Reserve, controlled by Lisa Farm. He can see you lying